Hello,
Sure.
everyone. I'm Meena Gopal. Welcome to Global Express. This is where we dissect developments in our backyard and its impact on India. This week, it's a rather large backyard that we're looking at, Tibet, which is back in the news after India gave a very unusual nod to a seven-member US congressional delegation to visit His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala. Despite the fact that the Dalai Lama would have been making his first trip to the United States since 2017 this week, and they could have met him there. The timing, the location, this is why the Dharamshala visit throws up four key questions. How does Tibet benefit from this visit, especially if the US is opening up two fronts against China, first Taiwan and now Tibet? What is the signal that Tibet's leaders in exile are sending China? Does it want status quo? Does it want to resume dialogue with China, with which it has held no talk since 2010? Or is it a signal that this is a turning point, a break from the past? And where does that leave India? Caught in the middle? The US is playing its Tibet card. Is India ready to play the Tibet card? So, in a standoff with the People's Liberation Army of China, will India continue to tread softly on China that is an occupation of Indian territory and is running rings around India and the Maldives and Nepal and Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and now, of course, Tibet? Unlocking the whys and wherefores for us today is the Honorable Sikyong, Mr. Penpa Sering, President of the Tibetan government in exile. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show. By the way, I expected you to be feted and be part of the delegation that was invited to Prime Minister Modi's swearing in. This has a precedent. In 2014, your predecessor was invited, but anyway, that's par for the course. So, but let's begin with the Dharamshala visit, sir, and the meeting that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had with the team of US lawmakers. What is the significance of this visit?
No, it's not very often that we have a high-profile US congressional delegation. The last time was in 2017 when I was posted as the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama in Washington, D.C. That was when Nancy Pelosi was the speaker, and I would say that was the highest level delegation that had visited Dharamsala and met with His Holiness and saw the Tibetan exile government in function. So it is important congressional delegation, and the composition of the delegation itself shows how important it is, because you have the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee from the Republican side, Chairman McCall. And then you also have the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which means to say that even though we got 391, 392 votes in the House floor for the Tibet Resolve Act, there is a lot of support within the Congress, in the House, as well as the Senate, where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate floor approved it with unanimity. So that is why it is important, the timing of this delegation just before His Holiness leaving to United States. In fact, His Holiness, the original plan was for His Holiness to get treatment by May end, but there were also other important programs that were already lined up, including the long life prayer offering by civil servants on the 11th of this month, and then 18th and 19th, the visit of the congressional delegation. So the private office decided that the delegation's visit should be over before His Holiness visits there. So from our perspective, yes, it is a very important delegation. One is, it does not happen every year. It happens once in many years. And the second is they are coming at a time when both the houses, both the Congress and the House and the Senate have adopted this Tibet Resolve Act. That is why, and this Tibet Resolve Act talks about the historical status of Tibet. And the findings and the recommendations also is that the Chinese government statement that Tibet has been part of China since ancient time is not acceptable.
Yeah, they've actually specifically said that it dates back to the 13th century in the Yuan dynasty. They've also renamed Tibet, haven't they? They've called it Xinjiang. Is that correct? Am I correct?
It's not just with Tibet. That is the overall strategy of the Chinese government to rename a lot of places, including places in Arunachal Pradesh in India,
Yeah.
and renaming all the places in South China Sea and all the disputed islands, whether it's Spratlys or Daewoo Islands and all those, they want to give Chinese name. And I remember telling a US leader at one time, about 8-10 years ago, when China designated this air defense identification zone, I told them now US has to be more careful when they claim the whole air, they can claim
Mm.
everything air, and that is
Below
exactly
it.
what.
Oh my
Yes.
gosh, that is dangerous. But what is the what do you achieve with this Resolve Tibet Act? Because yes, you have bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress from the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, and it's waiting, I believe, for President a sign off from President Joe Biden. But what are the implications of that act? Wasn't there another act before this? I mean, what power does an act passed in the U.S. Really have about about the China-Tibet standoff? Because I mean, it calls for China to resume dialogue, with Tibet, but China doesn't recognize the Tibetan government in exile. It has had no communication with the Dalai Lama since 2010. They've broken off any communication. Who is going to do the talking on the Resolve Tibet Act?
Now, the Resolve Tibet Act evolved because of our change in strategy by sticking to the middle way policy, which is approved by the parliament and supported by the majority of Tibetans and proposed by His Holiness. While following the same policy, just because I'm the Sikyong, I cannot change the policy, because we will have to go through a referendum if there is a change in policy in exile. But at the same time, while following the same policy, we decided to change our strategy to focus on the historical status of Tibet, because when we say middle way, then there
Hmm.
needs to be polarities. If there are no polarities, there's no value for middle way. So in this case, of course, there can be so many polarities from a political point of view, social, economic, and all that. But since this is majorly a political issue, we decided to focus on the historical status for 4 reasons. One is to tell the Chinese government that they cannot change history, because history is in
Hmm.
the past, and it's best left to historians to decide whether Tibet was part of China or not. With me, I have 2 books which I carry with me when I reach out to governments. One by Michael Van Walt van Praag, called book called Tibet Brief 2020, which looks at the status of Tibet from a legal perspective and also a social context of how nations were defined those days, from the Yuan dynasty to the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty, from 13th century to 20th century. That is one thing. We have our perspective, our own history. Chinese have a perspective on Tibetan history. Now, Westerners look at it from a legal perspective and proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China in this book that Michael wrote, consulting with more than 100 scholars from Inner Asia, not just Tibet. And another book is by a Chinese professor called Professor Lau Hanxiang, who is also now retired and based in San Diego. And he took his materials from the Chinese Communist Party website on the historical records of the Yuan from 1271 to 1368, or of the Ming from 1368 to 1644, or of the Qings, who are Manchus, from 1644 to 1911. And he proves that Imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China.
I've
So
seen that.
yes, and this book is already in Chinese, and the English translation, the formatting is being done, and in the next 2-3 months, this book should be out. And he will also be working, he has worked on the Ming and the Qing from 1368 to 1911, but he wants to work on the Yuan dynasty and also the nationalist movement as to how they claim Tibet to be part of China. And his book is not a historical narrative, but more an argument as to how Tibet is not considered part of China by Imperial China. So with these 2 books, we also go to governments and tell them that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then you're going against international law, because whether it's happening to Ukraine today or whether it happened to Tibet 74 years ago in 1950, is the same international law after the formation of United Nations and the modern definition of the nation state. So that is one thing. The second reason is to tell the international community, you just cannot parrot what the Chinese government asks you to say.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You become an accomplice in China's propaganda, and their propaganda is so pervasive around the world that every country keeps repeating that Tibet is part of PRC. And then the governments also say they support negotiations between representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. Then my contention is you are removing the very ground for negotiation when you say Tibet is part of PRC. Then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us?
That's a very good point.
And the third thing we tell is to the Tibetan community, if Tibetans don't study Tibetan history, who else will? What will we pass on to the next generation? Just as every community have this saying that hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So we also hope for the best that we get to go back to Tibet under the different circumstances, and then work towards getting the younger generations of Tibet to take up leadership positions when they come of age, so we have to prepare them. And the fourth reason is even within the Tibetan community, we have both independence advocates and middle way advocates, middle way being the official position, even though the number of people who support the independence of Tibet is less. My contention is, why can't we all work together to bring all the 130, 40,000? So His Holiness also has been saying whenever the Tibetan Youth Congress holds annual meetings or, general body meetings, then they seek audience with His Holiness, and His Holiness always tells them that if you are aspiring for independence in future, you should prove the independent status of Tibet in the past. So
can I just come in and ask this very important question? You have, the Resolve Act, the Tibetan Resolve Act calls for a free Tibet. And are there, you have a diaspora of 130,000, 140,000 Tibetans who live outside Tibet. Do they endorse this call for a free Tibet? Now, you've said that there is a movement which also calls for a middle way, which is basically, if I understand correctly, which is then you stay as a Tibetan autonomous region within China. Are there people who continue to advocate that?
No, there are people who advocate independence for Tibet for their own reasons. They have valid reasons for doing that. And everybody has the freedom to seek whatever they need to. So there is and we live in a democracy, so everybody can have their opinion. The question is, how practical is independence? Or can that be achieved? So these are questions between middle way and independence. But for the larger cause of Tibet in the long term, focusing on the historical status brings the Tibetan community together, because that is how we have to move together. Right now, there is diversity in thinkings, and that also contributes to disunity within the Tibetan community. So our effort is to bring everybody together. Now, this is from the Tibetan perspective. So we have not just been talking the talk, but we have been walking the talk in terms of reaching out to the US Congress over the last 2 years and 2 months. We have been working on this Tibet Resolve Act. And this act talks about one element is challenging China's false narrative on Tibetan history.
Yes, yes.
Second element of that is the right of Tibetan peoples to self-determination. And the third part of this act is to define Tibet, not just Tibet Autonomous Region, because Indian media also, whenever they show Tibet, they show only Tibet Autonomous Region, not the traditional Tibet, where His Holiness comes from in Amdo, or the eastern region of Yangtze, in the Kham region. All those are excluded from the Tibetan map, which China does. Then I don't understand why Indian media also has to project the same in terms of territory of Tibet. Because the territory of Tibet is where the Tibetans lived traditionally for centuries. And that includes the Kham and Amdo region, what China has segregated into Qinghai and also incorporate those provinces into Yunnan and Sichuan provinces. So
Ah,
we have to counter those
false
narratives.
narrative.
Yeah, so mainly three elements of the act, which gives us a tool to work with other governments so that it can become a pressure on the Chinese government to negotiate with the Tibetans peacefully. And that is what we are hoping for.
But where does it leave you internationally? In the sense, are you now going to, once this Tibet Resolve Act is signed in by the U.S. Congress, how does that does it give it some kind of international legitimacy, or do you need to now go to the UN? What are the next steps to, or will you just have to launch a kind of a publicity campaign where even countries that refuse to allow His Holiness the Dalai Lama to even travel to many countries in Europe and Asia, those countries should be sort of co-opted to the cause, and India, of course.
The only countries that we can reach out is the free world, the democratic countries. The authoritarian regimes are all aligned with China because China not only talks about its hegemonistic ambitions in the region, but also talks about global initiatives like global security initiative, global economic initiative, global civilizational initiative. And they are the biggest bully in the world, and they are trying to get all the authoritarian governments on their side to create a new international order. And this is a very dangerous trend because China wants to export its system of governance, its definition of what human rights should be from their perspective, and the international community should accept it. And we don't have too much trust in the United Nations because right now, after US backed out during President Trump's presidency, they rejoined, but much of the space is taken over by the Chinese in shaping the United Nations. And we have also always considered United Nations as one of the most undemocratic institutions in this world. It's like a human body without arms and legs. So
That's a very strong statement.
our next step would be to reach out to other governments who value the same things that America does, of freedom, of dignity, of human dignity, of democracy, and all this freedom, free flow of information. So we have to reach out to these governments and look at their structure, systems, their relations.
Which countries would those be, sir? Which countries would those be specifically?
Definitely North America and Europe. And Europe is still waking up to the realities, and some leaders, I believe, still have not learned the lesson of dealing with China. But overall, in Europe, there is this understanding that the immediate problem is Russia, but the long-term challenge is definitely China. So that understanding is there. Now, how that will translate into policies and programs, because it's very perplexing to understand the European Union system, where you don't have a foreign policy or a common trade policy, and every country has to face up to China. So most probably there are things coming up to develop an instrument for anti-economic coercion, how to face that unitedly with the whole of European nations behind it. But China likes to play its own.
China does use the economic tool to sort of force countries into submission, as we can see what they're doing in India's own neighborhood and in Pakistan.
Exactly.
And now they've tried it in Iran, and I think they're trying it in the Gulf countries also.
No, we keep telling the Europeans, as to some of my friends tell me, oh, the dragon is biting at us, meaning China. And I tell them, who fed the dragon to become so strong to be able to bite at you?
Yeah,
Because at the time, the world community thought that if China becomes part of the global community, they'll become more responsible. And
that's
US
right.
has a hard way. And with Europe also, there is little understanding, but they still need to understand a little more, not just think about their short-term national interests, but for the long term of humanity and of the free world, and to preserve the international order that we have that promotes more freedom, not restriction on human freedom. So these are elements. That's why I keep saying now, it is the Americans, it's the Europeans, it's the Japanese, it's the Taiwanese who made China strong for what it is.
That's right.
And think that China is biting at you. If you still want to keep feeding the dragon, then whose fault is it? This is something that the Europeans need to understand. I'm sure it's not like they don't understand. Some of them say that we are not so naive now. Some of them say we are not as naive as we were before. And you
Maybe.
talked about reaching out to the global south. That is where I think a lot of education needs to be done. I was in Colombia, Mexico, in Brazil. They have very
Africa.
understanding of the motivations of China, including what China is doing in Asia, creating, because my contention is that if you supply Ukraine with arms and ammunition, Ukrainians will have to kill Russians, or Russians will have to kill Ukrainians. So it's loss on both sides. Of course, Ukraine needs to be defended. Otherwise, it'll have a lot of implications on Russia's relations with European countries and China's ambitions towards Taiwan in the years to come. But then we resort to nonviolence. That is why I keep telling them that the only nonviolent way to bring China on its knees is economy. So despite all the rhetoric, China's economy, of course, they are having a lot of problems with foreign direct investment and slowdown of economy, and the property market and local governments, unemployment, a whole lot of things, problems they have. So the only way is by giving them less business, because if you look at Europe alone, you're talking about Europeans exporting only 200 billion US dollars worth of goods and services to China, and 600 billions import into the 27 European countries.
Yeah. That's a huge disparity.
400 billion every year. You're talking about more than $1 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserve that China has. So once they have all this money, then they splurge it on space technology or military technology or artificial intelligence, or creating all this Belt and Road, giving money loan through Belt initiatives, and creating all these debt economies, and taking over all these strategic locations from Malacca Straits to the Sihanouk Valley in Cambodia, or Coco Islands in Burma, or Hambantota in Sri Lanka, or Gwadar Port in Pakistan, or now the evolving relation between Maldives and China and India. So these are all things that the global community needs to be informed about what China is doing. It's not enough to say, oh, you Africans were also colonized, we were also colonized, so colonized people should help each other. Are they really helping?
Is that the argument?
Yeah. And I think it's time to see, because at one time the West thought that they could change China. Now the question is, how much has China changed the West, or the West has changed China? This is also a subject that needs to be explored.
That's a very interesting point also, because I don't think the West is the power right now to change China. Because unless you turn off the tap and not buy their goods, which they need, which the West needs for their own industries and their own businesses, that is the basic problem here. But can I ask you one more question about His Holiness the Dalai Lama? Has he then not abandoned, but is questioning the middle way? Because, literally, you have to start a war, maybe a war of words right now, to change the, the understanding of what China is really about. Is that something that the Tibetan government in exile is, wanting? And secondly, you've also been promoting autonomy within the Chinese, sort of government and so on and so forth. Is that at an end now? You no longer want autonomy. You want independence. Can we say that?
No. We are very, very committed to the middle way policy. That is something that I have reiterated 100 times. So we are very, very committed to the middle way. But as I mentioned before, when we speak about the middle way, if there is no recognition of polarities, there's no value for middle way. There's no
Yeah.
liberation. That is why we are focusing on the historical status, because there has to be a recognition on the historical status. Then only there is value for middle way. So
But where
please
where
don't.
is that going to lead the Tibetan people, sir? Because they seem to be under a lot of pressure, even within Tibet.
No, within Tibet, we are talking about there being no political space whatsoever, and Chinese government using all kinds of artificial intelligence to control and surveil people through DNA sample collection, iris scanning, electronic identification. Now every citizen being reduced to a barcode or a QR code.
My gosh.
Where you can be tracked, and you always live under the multiple security agencies and United Front Work Department. They want to be responsible for setting up curriculums for monastic institutions.
I believe
And
your
now,
Tibetan's monasteries curriculum has been taken over by the Chinese.
of course, yes, even the curriculums. So even the reincarnation, they want to be responsible. So His Holiness response to this things have been very, very, His Holiness, how
I
human.
thought it was a very clever response, what His
Yes.
Holiness said. It was a very, very smart move to say that, that he will not be reborn. That, isn't
Yes.
that what he said?
Now, His Holiness said if Chinese leadership is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first, because this reincarnation concept is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. And if they're convinced that there is life after that death and that there could be reincarnations, then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first. Then maybe Deng Xiaoping. Now even Zhang is with us. So then maybe the Dalai Lamas. That is how we believe in that system to be responsible for selecting reincarnations.
Yeah, the
So
wicked sense of humor,
situation,
I must say.
yes, continues to be very grave. That is why, since China is not responding positively now, and if we reach out to the international community, those pressures could help China to come on the negotiating table.
So, can I go back to the plight of the Tibetans living in Tibet itself under Chinese occupation? I mean, I believe they're being forced into marrying Han Chinese who are being settled in Tibet in huge numbers. And as you said, the Tibetan monasteries curriculum, of course, is being manipulated. But there are hundreds of Tibetan refugees who are now flooding into the US as well as India, where apparently Tibetan parents are shepherding the younger generation into India, so for their own safety, smuggling their children basically across the border. So, could you tell us if there's a deliberate move by the Chinese to erase Tibetan culture altogether? Is that
There's
what
no,
their way of life? Because the Tibetans' way of life apparently is being destroyed. Is that
there's no
correct?
There's no two ways about it. What you're saying is exactly correct. It's not just the Tibetans speaking about this, but it's also the UN special rapporteurs having come out with a report on this situation. So, and then the Freedom House calling Tibet one of the least free countries in this world, alongside South Sudan and North Korea and Syria. So those are findings by independent bodies. It's not just the Tibetans speaking about it. The number of children that have been coming out of Tibet in the mid 90s till up to 2008, we used to receive any number between 2,000 to 3,000 children, mostly children, left here to study, not knowing whether they will ever meet their family again or not, and having to cross the Himalayas. Sometimes they lose their toes and fingers because of frostbite. Sometimes they get. So all those are there. Now, what the Chinese government is doing to Tibet and Tibetans today, not only to the Tibetans, but also Uyghurs and Mongols, Inner
Yes.
Mongolia,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
doing. Their belief is that if there are no ethnicities, what they call Tibet as minorities or ethnicities or nationalities, if there are no nationalities, then there are no nationality issues. That is what they are aiming at. And the very identity of all the nationalities, whether it's the Tibetans or Uyghurs or Mongols, is their language. and religion.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
in the case of Tibet, sometimes people ask us whether Tibetan language has something to do with Chinese or not, because right now it's occupied by China. But we
yeah.
have to enlighten them that Tibetan language or the Tibetan script comes from India, from the Brahmi and Gupta script in 7th
Ah,
century.
oh, I
And
see.
Tibetan religion also comes from India. There was a debate in 8th century between disciple of Shanta Rakshita, Kamalashila, and the
Mhm.
Chinese monks. And the logic of the Indian monks were far superior to the Chinese monks. And that is why the Tibetan emperor, Songtsen Gampo, decided to adopt Buddhism that came from India. And that is why even today, His Holiness traces Tibetan Buddhism's origin back to Nagarjuna of Andhra Pradesh. So we follow the
Really?
Nalanda tradition of
Yeah, yeah.
even within India, there are so many traditions. So these are facts which are unknown, even to Indians. Sometimes I have to tell them the first king of Tibet, way back 2,300 years ago, came from India. There are stories
My
about
God.
Prince, so the connection between the cultural and linguistic and all this religious connection between India and Tibet is much more deeper, because today China is trying to claim Tibet as Xizang, destroying all this historical background. They are claiming that Tibetan Buddhism also came from China. Tibetan language also came from all this nonsense they keep repeating, all the untruths they keep repeating. Because I remember one of the stalwart Indian socialists said that communism is built on a foundation of lies, and if they believe that if they repeat the lie 100 times, then it turns into truth.
Becomes the
And that's
truth.
exactly what the Chinese government is doing, even in 21st century, in this age of
Yeah.
electronic.
That's
Uh,
true. Even though we know that it's so easy to find the truth. If I could just go back to the comment that you made about, India and Tibet's historic links, do you feel that the Indian government has done enough? I mean, we've opened our hearts and our mind space to the Tibetans. I mean, here close to Bangalore, we have Bailakuppe. I mean, so the space has been given, but have we supported the Tibetan cause politically? Have we basically given His Holiness the Dalai Lama a platform to air his views? And have we not done so because of Chinese pressure? Or because the Chinese are sitting on our borders, breathing down our neck, basically 5 kilometers here and there, and because they have the ability to squeeze us militarily and economically?
yes. Now, I always keep saying there are a lot of intelligent people in the Indian administration, in the government, and politicians. So I'm nobody to advise the Indian government on what they need to do. But as I was saying earlier, also, our strategy would be how do we align our interests with the interests of that nation? Because there's few facts that we have to accept and understand, that if there has to be a resolution through peaceful means on the Sino-Tibet conflict, there is no other way than by talking with the Chinese leadership. Until such a time, we have to reach out to the international community, and we don't have this over expectation of international community leaving aside their national interests for the interests of the Tibetans. So our strategy would be, how do we define our interests and align that with the interests of that nation, whoever we are reaching out to? Only then there can be some traction or some movement in their support for Tibet. So this is the strategy that we are working on, and how we are trying to reach out to the international community. And this will be our work for the next few years.
So basically, the point is that India's one China policy, it has tamped down on it. It hasn't really made a big noise about this one China policy after China did give stapled visas to visitors from Jammu and Kashmir, and it's that I think upset India quite a bit.
Yeah,
And of
there's
course,
this position the Indian government has taken since the last 14, 15 years. And that has been helpful, because what we understand of China is that they will respect only strength, not weakness. And
exactly.
India should not show its weakness. border issue, the position that Indian government has taken on the border issue is much, much stronger than what it has been before. So the position being that if there is no disengagement from all sectors, there won't be normalization of relations. And we all know that there are a lot of things on the table between China and India, but this is also the time to play the Tibet card, to recalibrate
Yes,
his position on China and Tibet. But what I would like to believe is that you still have Indo-Tibetan Border Police and Indo-Tibetan Border Force. They have not changed it
that's
to
right.
Indo-China Border Police or whatever. That also underlines
Yeah.
India's
They're the
position.
ones who did a remarkable job in Afghanistan, building all those roads. The highway, the Zaranj Dalaram highway was built by the Indo-Tibetan Border Force. And
Yeah.
they come to, I remember during the tsunami, how they were fixing, all the roads and, all the blockages in South India as
Yes.
well.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Dynamics of India-China relations also has its impact on India, on the Indian leadership and the intelligentsia. And now, since China's belligerence on the Himalayan border, we can hear more voices from the Indian think tanks and others. So government may have its position, maybe they are recalibrating their position. So whatever it is, we have always been very, very grateful to the government and people of India. If it is not for the government and people of India, we don't exist as we are, or we do. So we have, because of our historical relationship, of course, politically, we would definitely want Indian governments to do more or be a little more vocal, but then we also understand the situation that India is in, unlike the European or the American governments, because you're talking about close proximity of border on land.
Exactly.
Japan has
Yeah.
with maritime border.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think the previous moves to placate China,
Mm,
Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit in 2003, and even during 2014 when Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, first visit to India, that was also a sort of a soft touch. I can see that things are changing, that India's strategy to tackle China will change, and hopefully we will see the benefits percolating towards the Tibetan people.
mm,
If we can, with this Tibet Resolve Act,
mm,
maybe India is also being pushed and nudged by the US to take a stronger line,
mhm.
on Tibet, possibly. Any concluding statements, sir, if you would make on Chinese pressure and how to offset Chinese pressure on your people and India?
I think we have to learn to call out Chinese hoaxes, lies, and all that, because right now China has all the military power because of its economic power. So the more business you give it to them, they become more powerful. That is something that countries will have to realize, understand, not make China stronger than what it already is, because it is a threat to the free world and the global order. So that is one thing I would like to reiterate. It's very important for every government to understand, even with the Indian government also, despite all the rhetorics and belligerence that is going on on the border, the business is going up. So that does not help India. Maybe India has its reason to strengthen its own production capacities, without which they cannot do right now. But in the long term, even India will have to think about their balance of trade with China, which makes them powerful. Because of their economic power, they have the military power, they have the political power, and they have all the money to spend it on all the things that the free world doesn't like. So that is where I think we need to apply our mind. Of course, nobody wants anarchy in China. It's going to
Yeah.
be very detrimental for the whole world. But if now we tell the countries that we go to that please don't look at us only as victims of communist China. If you can look at us as partners to bring about positive changes in China, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongols, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, pro-democracy leaders, They are all internal forces, because if we have to bring positive changes in China, you need both internal and external forces, and we are the internal forces. So if that is the perspective that they can look at us, then it will be more productive relationship that will help everybody. And we want to see a smooth transition, more peace, freedom for the Chinese people, and similarly for all the nationalities in China and elsewhere, in North Korea, Russia, wherever there are authoritarian regimes. I think there need to be more freedom, because we are all born free. We are not meant to be enslaved mentally or physically. And that is what Chinese government is doing and thinking. They think that few people can decide on their whims and fancies as to where people should do, what people should do. That is not acceptable at this age.
That is beautifully put. Thank you very much. We hope to that His Holiness the Dalai Lama returns in good health and leads the Tibetan people into a brighter future. Thank you very much, Honorable Sikyong Mr. Penpa Sering, President of the Tibetan Government in Exile. Really appreciate you joining our program. Thank you very much. Please do click on the Global Express on the New Indian Express website and share this web. Thank you.